Hey, what is going on, Xbox and PC fans? It's Josh, back after almost a year hiatus. I apologize for the supreme lack of content. I made a move from Florida all the way to California and had a job that was just consuming all my time, but fortunately I am now beyond that position and going back to doing IT work for myself, for clients obviously, but working for myself, which will have some benefits. I can get back on YouTube and discuss a lot of things that we geeks love to discuss. So with the kind of re-kickoff of the channel, I would love to present to you what I believe are going to be the top components that you're going to need and want to play next generation games on your PC. So when I say next generation games, I'm talking about games that are going to be released for the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Project Scarlet. Everyone knows, consoles kind of create the baseline in terms of specs for developers. Developers tend to choose the platform that sells the most units, and they really use that as their lead development platform. And then they'll make variations from there for other consoles. Fortunately, we know quite a bit about the next generation consoles, and they're going to be very, very similar to one another, just as they are today. x86, both utilizing AMD for their processing power. We know a little bit about their non-volatile storage, their intention for that, and some other things as well. So with that in mind, we can kind of set our sights, if you will, on what developers will have to work with, what they will be optimizing for, and whom will benefit that. Obviously, as a PC consumer, you really have the ability to go above and beyond what is offered in consoles and what is going to be outputted by those future consoles. And today, I'm going to go over the components that are really, really, really important and kind of the minimum spec, as well as what I would recommend that you have as a spec. And I imagine developers will have these requirements as well, these minimum and recommended specs for next generation games, for AAA titles in particular. And we want to make sure that you have those in your system. I know tomorrow it is almost Thanksgiving 2019 when I'm recording this video, and tomorrow is Black Friday. So if you want to get yourself prepared for next generation gaming today, you can do that in an almost completely optimal fashion. I'm going to go down the list here of components: CPU, GPU, system memory, and your non-volatile storage, as well as your motherboard or platform. So really the top 5 things that you will need and or want to play next generation games on your PC. So without further ado, we're going to start it off with the CPU. And everyone knows, if you've been looking at the news at all, that again, Microsoft and Sony are both going to use AMD as their partner for processing in these next generation consoles. So what that means is the PlayStation 5, the Xbox Project Scarlet, whatever it winds up being named after this initial code name, is both are going to be utilizing the Zen 2 architecture CPUs. We've had confirmation from this from Microsoft and Sony. They are said to be 8-core and 16-thread parts. We do know also about the GPU. The GPU in those systems is going to be based on kind of Navi 2.0, which is essentially the foundation that AMD has created and has launched in their current Navi lineup. And it's going to have additional features such as hardware accelerated ray tracing. We also know that these platforms will be utilizing NVMe SSD storage. Now, we don't know for sure the system RAM in there. We don't know for sure, the chipset that's going to be in there, but with these platforms coming out in 2020, I think it's safe to assume that these will take advantage of AMD's, latest technologies, if not ones that have been developed in the previous year. AM4, X570 has been out now in the mainstream consumer market in 2019 for a while. That supports PCI Express 4.0. Will you need that? Will their non-volatile storage SSDs be fast enough to make that a requirement for you? And what platform, how much RAM, etc., what GPU, CPU will you need in your computer? That's what we're going to go over now. So I'm going to hit you guys up with the kind of some, reasoning why you're going to need these components. And then I am going to go ahead and tell you what you need as a minimum and also the recommended. So I'll keep a little chart somewhere up here to make it easier for you guys to follow along, and I'll kind of fill in as I go. And I'll put it down in the description as well with some links that I think are kind of products that you may want to take into consideration and definitely worthy of looking at this holiday season if you want to prepare yourself to play these next-gen games. So we're going to get into it. The CPU, you are going to need a minimum of 8 cores and 16 threads in your CPU. Probably saying, Josh, that's crazy. The current generation consoles have 8 cores, and not all current generation games need an 8-core CPU. You are correct. However, the current generation consoles use crappy, low-power Jaguar core CPUs that were intended for tablets. That is not the case with next-gen consoles. They're going to be using Zen 2 architecture CPUs. 8 cores, 16 threads. I've heard rumors of clock speeds around 3.2 gigahertz, which would put it in about, I would say, probably a 45 watt, maybe even less, depending if they go with a newer node, like 7 nanometer plus. But that will give them plenty of additional headroom for, power to go to the GPU. But if that's the case, you're going to give developers 8 cores, 16 threads. You had better believe that developers are going to use 8 cores and 16 threads for their games in these next generation machines. So I'm not saying that you need to have the latest and greatest CPU when those consoles come out to play these games, but you are going to need 8 cores and 16 threads to play these games as they were intended to be played and not pared down. After all, we are, PC elitist, and the consoles really should be considered a baseline, unless maybe you're on a laptop or something of that nature, where portability is, more important than actually, the fidelity of the graphics of the game. So I'm talking about PCs, desktop PCs in this instance. And with that being said, again, if you get an 8-core, 16-thread CPU from Intel, that will work just fine. Keeping in mind that optimization, even on AMD products, is going to be for the Zen 2 architecture. This is going to be a recurring theme of this video. You want to have what is in these boxes because they are going to be what is the most optimized for by game developers. So even with AMD, you can pull off a first generation Ryzen CPU, like a 1700 or a 1700X, 1800X. You can get those CPUs for $100 an hour or less on eBay, which is absurd. And they all clock around 4 gigahertz. So that higher frequency should make up for any kind of discrepancy or gains rather in IPC and reduced internal latency the CPU that Zen 2 has, because again, I believe those will come in at a lower clock speed, maybe around 3.2 gigahertz, something like that. Zen 2 cores on next generation consoles. So any Intel 8-core 16-thread, any AMD 8-core 16-thread, could be first-gen Ryzen, could be second-gen Ryzen, the minimum spec, that's what you're going to want. Now, the recommended spec for CPU, again, recurring theme, you're going to want what's in a box. So although you could get from Intel or from AMD, newer generation CPUs that are coming out later, in 2020. So Zen 3, whatever Intel is offering with higher core and thread counts, that will be obviously fine. But you can buy today the Ryzen 3700X, and that's an 8-core, 16-thread Zen 2 architecture CPU that will be extremely well optimized for when playing games on next-generation machines, and therefore on your PC as well. That will transfer over. So that is the kind of bottom of the stack for my recommendation. And then to reiterate, more cores, more threads, the better you're going to have an experience with the more cores and more threads, more resources that your CPU has, the better off you're going to be. On a PC, we tend to have a little bit more overhead than consoles do. So we have things running in the background, maybe your antivirus software, maybe you have Dropbox, maybe you have the desire to stream while you play games. That's going to require additional resources above and beyond 8 cores and 16 threads. So if you want to buy today a Ryzen 9 3900X with 12 cores and 24 threads, that's 8 logical more cores than what's on the kind of minimum recommended 8-core 16-thread Zen 2 part. That'll be awesome. If you want to go a notch above that, 3950X, with 16 physical cores, 32 logical cores, that seems like a lot, but the more the better. Hell, if you want to get yourself into a next generation or a new, generation 3000 Zen 2 Threadripper part, that is absolutely going to be mind-boggling. But again, keep in mind, I think that the most optimization will probably occur for a very, very similar CPU to what's in those boxes. So I would imagine in terms of gaming that the 8-core 16-thread part should suit you just fine and be extremely well optimized for. Same thing goes for Intel. If you need to get 10 cores or 12 cores or whatever it is that they're offering in their mainstream, hopefully they'll be at that point sometime in 2020 when these next-gen consoles release. If not, they do have high-end desktop offerings as well. I want to say they go up to 18 cores now, and we should be even further higher core and thread count, hopefully in 2020 for Intel as well. So that is kind of the minimum spec. 8-core, 16-thread of really, first-gen Ryzen, second-gen Ryzen, any Intel CPU. And then the recommended spec is going to start with 3700X, the first Zen 2, fully optimized for architecture part, 8-core, 16 threads, and then kind of go up from there with both Intel and AMD in terms of core count. So I'm going to mark it up there for you so you can write that down, or you have written down at least, you can refer to it. And then we're going to move to the GPU. Now, again, we know Xbox One successor, the Xbox Project Scarlet, is going to be using same thing as the PlayStation 5, AMD's Zen 2 architecture based off of, not Zen 2, RDNA architecture 2.0 based off of their RDNA version 1, which is what they currently have in the market with the 5700 XT, and there's going to be so much proliferation of RDNA products in the near future, and also with RDNA 2.0, AMD has penned a deal with Samsung to get RDNA into mobile devices like cell phones and tablets. They're going to have these things rolling out in APUs very soon, at least RDNA 1.0, and surely by the time they roll out these next-gen machines, they'll have RDNA 2.0 based APUs for desktops, laptops, etc. So RDNA is going to be everywhere, and I'll probably do a separate video on this, but I believe that RDNA 2.0 graphics architecture will not use dedicated area on the die just for doing ray tracing. I believe it's going to be a very similar thing with what happened with NVIDIA back in the day when they purchased a company called PhysX. They did not take a portion of their their GPU and just pull a chunk off and add a different chunk that was strictly for physics processing. They didn't do that. They kind of rolled it into the architecture, and I believe that the flexibility that gives developers is what they want at this point and what AMD is going to provide. Obviously, Intel, NVIDIA will have their own offerings. Both supposedly will, NVIDIA for sure. Intel allegedly will have hardware-based ray tracing support sometime next year with their kind of first, well, not their first attempt, but their 2020 attempt at dedicated GPUs. And we will see how those work out. Those cards will certainly be viable. They will obviously, allow you to enable ray tracing on your PC for next-gen games that use ray tracing. And I think that's fine. So any of those parts will do. But as a minimum spec, I'm going to say that you're going to want something that handles, we keep calling them next generation APIs, and I don't know why. They really are current nowadays, but low-level APIs like DirectX 12, Vulkan, things, other APIs that really do have great low-level support, that really get close to the metal, close to the hardware, so to speak, take advantage of things like asynchronous compute. So I would say if you're going to go with the NVIDIA route, you're going to want to have something a little bit newer than Maxwell, although you certainly could play it on a Maxwell-based card, depending on how much VRAM you have, which is one other thing I'll go over here real quick. But, Pascal is something I would aim for, as that really had a big improvement over Maxwell in terms of how it handled low-level APIs. And that's certainly, we're not going to have any DX11 titles, I don't think, coming out on next-gen consoles. It's all going to be a DX12 or Vulkan. Probably use one of those two APIs. So on the AMD side, really anything that is, GCN, Graphics Core Next, that goes back quite some time. Those tend to be pretty well adapted to and for low-level APIs like Vulkan and DX12. They tend to benefit because they've got synchronous compute built in, and you're not really wasting any GPU time with those products. So, I would say Pascal, Turing, whatever the next iteration is, NVIDIA is going to be offering. I think it's Ampere in 2020. Good possibility. And those can get a recommendation for purchase now, as those NVIDIA cards, the RTX cards, currently have hardware-based ray tracing support. So those will get a nod. However, again, you're going to want to have what's in these boxes. So I would say keep it, with AMD RDNA 2.0 if possible. That's going to be the most heavily optimized for. And although it's not out yet, I will say that the performance of the current RDNA 1.0 cards is absolutely phenomenal. The games look amazing. And again, they're going to be heavily optimized for. So minimum spec, any architecture that's GCN or Pascal and forward for NVIDIA as far as the architecture is concerned of the GPUs. And then as far as VRAM is concerned, you really are going to need 8 gigabytes of VRAM. I've been playing games recently like Star Wars, Jedi Fallen Order, and that game at 1440p is using over 7 gigabytes of VRAM. So these next generation consoles, they're talking about doing, native 4K, 60 FPS, and that's going to require over and above that. So if you want to play these games on your PC, if you have a 1440p monitor, even a 1080p monitor, I really do believe you're going to need, at a minimum requirement, you might be able to pull off 6 gigabytes of VRAM in certain scenarios for certain games and certain resolutions, lower ones obviously. But you're really going to want to have a card that's got 8 gigabytes of VRAM on the card, if not more. So that's your minimum spec. Any GCN card, Pascal or later architecture for NVIDIA, and 8 gigabytes of VRAM, 6 if you just want to scrape by some of the time, but you probably won't be able to play all the games with a card with that little VRAM on it, at least, not a decent resolution. So that's your minimum spec for your GPU. The recommended spec is, again, what's in the box. Your RDNA 2.0 is what's going to be in these consoles. That is what you're going to want to get for your PC because that's going to be the most heavily optimized for. And I would say you're going to want to pack 12 gigabytes of VRAM on those cards. I think we're going to see that on the NVIDIA side. Certainly whatever they're offering at the time will be a viable alternative, and we'll have to see how Intel does with their dedicated GPUs. Should be a viable alternative as well. Moving on from the GPU, we're going to look at things like non-volatile storage. It's not a very sexy term, but non-volatile storage just means storage that keeps your data when you turn your computer off. So we know that these next generation consoles aren't going to be utilizing hard drives, mechanical hard drives any longer. Thank the Lord. They're all going to be using PlayStation 5, Xbox Scarlet are going to be utilizing solid state, so NAND or flash-based memory, and they're going to be using that through NVMe, which basically means they're going to be using AMD's chipset and motherboard with native support for M.2. Very likely is going to be the slot they're going to go in, and the interface they're going to use to connect is going to be NVMe 1.3, 1.4, and they may, depending on the quality of the NAND, they may push beyond what PCI Express 3.0 is capable of. So that's about 3.5 gigabytes per second read and write. And, if they get into PCI Express 4.0, which I fully expect them to do, again, they've been available in AMD's mainstream consumer products now for months and months in 2019. So I expect them to utilize PCI Express 4.0, but whether or not you will need PCI Express 4.0 and a PCIe 4.0 SSD really depends on the quality of the NAND and the quality of the solid-state drives that they put into those consoles. So if they put in a solid-state drive in the PlayStation 5 and the Xbox Scarlet that's going to do read and write over and above what any SSD can achieve using a PCI Express 3.0 link, then you're very likely going to need, even at a minimum, PCI Express 4.0, solid state drive. So right now, I can tell you that I've used just playing Star Wars. I did a test. I loaded it up, kind of had some stuttering issues due to really loading of the game. So very I/O intensive areas of the game where you're loading in a ton of assets off of the solid state drive. Microsoft and Sony have both said they fully intend to use solid state drives in that fashion to stream assets in real time, so to avoid things like loading screens. And obviously they want to have as low of loading times as possible initially when you're going into the game. So anyway, I tested this on SATA-based drive and had a lot of stuttering. I don't even want to see what it looks like on a mechanical hard drive. Thank God it's not going to be in these new machines. I did test it on a 970 EVO Plus 1 terabyte PCI 3.0, and that basically saturates that link, gives you about 3.5 gigabytes, just under that maybe for write speed. But in terms of read, you really are getting about the full saturation for the PCI 3.0 kind of interface, that bus. And there is still some loading judder in the game, even post-patch that was supposed to fix that. Not a whole lot, but I can tell you when you move over to PCI Express 4.0, I recently loaded it up, same game, same parts of the game, and ran through it on it's a Gigabyte RS 1 terabyte PCI Express 4.0 SSD, and they're almost completely gone. There's a tiny little hiccup here or there, but they're basically completely gone. So again, depending on the quality, depending on the speed of the SSDs that they put in next-gen consoles, that's going to kind of determine what this minimum recommended spec are going to be. But at this point, I'm going to say your minimum spec is going to be the very, 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 very best PCI 3.0 SSD you can buy, one that fully saturates that PCI Express. Typically, it's an X4 connection for an M.2 NVMe SSD, and that'll give you about 3.5 gigabytes per second. So I would say that is your minimum recommended spec for next-gen console gaming on your PC. Now, the recommended spec is obviously going to be PCI, Gen 4, and really as good as you can get. If you can get one that's doing double what PCI 3.0 can offer, those aren't available today. I think the best PCI Gen 4 SSD is the one I just mentioned, Gigabyte RS. Is a very, very nice drive. It's doing 5 gigabytes a second reads, about 4.5 gigabytes a second writes, so it's phenomenally quick. But that has still yet to kind of, the quality and the speed of the memory on that drive is yet to saturate that link. So we will see products, later down the road in 2020 that will achieve, saturation of that link and provide you with 7 gigabytes, read and write speed. It's going to be absolutely bonkers. But that is going to be what I would recommend for non-volatile storage in your machine to avoid things like those hiccups related to, data streaming off of that drive into your games for next-gen titles. I just want to kind of throw this in here real quick as well. I'm talking about AAA titles. I'm not talking about next generation, arcade games like pinball or whatever. I'm talking about the next generation games that are AAA and extremely intensive graphically on not only your console, obviously, that you're going to get, or if you buy one of those next holiday season, but definitely on your PC components. So AAA gaming is what I'm talking about here, and that's again going to require the CPU, the GPU, and the SSD I just mentioned, as well as minimum and recommended spec for your platform. Again, that's going to be kind of dictated by the quality of the NAND and the quality of the SSDs that they use. But minimum, I'm going to say PCI Express 3.0. Really, any platform that is able to accommodate a CPU that has 8 cores and 16 threads, that can accommodate those other needs, for the SSD. Certainly, has an M.2 slot with NVMe and PCI Express 3.0. And then the only other thing that we really don't have much information on right now, but I can tell you you're going to need, because I've seen usage, up there, getting higher and higher every day with newer and newer games, is system RAM. Now, we had a massive leap last generation from the Xbox 360 and the PS3, both having half a gigabyte of RAM to 8 gigabytes of RAM. So 16 times more RAM than the previous generation. That's not going to happen. You're not going to see, I don't even know, 8 times 16 is a lot. Whatever, how much RAM that is, I don't know. But that's not going to be in these next-gen machines. I will tell you that, I play typically at 1440p, a lot at 4K, depending on the game engine being used. But system RAM in the games that I play right now, current utilization is about 12 gigabytes. And again, next-gen consoles targeting higher frame rates, doesn't really matter, but higher resolution certainly matters. Higher resolution assets, game textures, etc. They're going to require not only more VRAM, but also more system RAM. And again, that faster non-volatile storage as well. So RAM, the last thing I'll touch on here, the minimum spec, I will say, is going to be 16 gigabytes. You're not going to be able to get away with 8 gigabytes of RAM playing next-gen AAA titles. You're going to need 16 gigabytes of RAM. So that's minimum. Recommended, 32 gigabytes of RAM plus. Now, I've only got 16 currently. Again, it is Black Friday. This Friday, if you're watching this video at another time, you know, later on down the timeline, closer to these consoles release, prices should, obviously, become less and less. Technology marches on. We're getting higher capacity, for RAM. We're getting, higher capacity, higher speed, non-volatile storage SSDs, and obviously faster CPUs, GPUs, etc. as we move on here, better platforms and all this stuff. But that is my recommended 32 gigabytes plus for your RAM. And that's basically going to wrap it up, guys. If you have those things, the minimum requirements that you're going to see up here, you're going to be able to play next-gen console games on your PC, and you're going to be able to at least have parity in terms of graphical fidelity to what those machines offer. Now, if you go with the recommended spec, you're going to be able to boss it out. You're going to be able, if you've got more cores and more threads to throw at it, even higher frequencies, you're going to get higher frame rates. If you've got a more powerful GPU, in particular, one based on what's in the box, RDNA 2.0, I think you're going to absolutely kill it in terms of, resolution and frame rate. Just overall performance is going to look phenomenal on those cards. Again, the alternatives from NVIDIA and Intel will remain viable options. But they're not going to be optimized for like RDNA 2.0, like what's in those boxes is going to be optimized for. Same with Zen 2. You can get a Zen 3 CPU, and that's fine. That's going to be awesome. But all the optimization effort these game developers are going to be putting in to optimizing for these titles is going to be going toward the Zen 2 architecture in particular, because that is what is in the box. So, keep all this stuff in mind. If you're able to get this stuff before next-gen consoles come out, I think it's great. You'll be ready for, launch titles to come out on those new machines and be able to take full advantage of it. So I hope you guys all have a phenomenal Turkey Day. Tomorrow is Thanksgiving 2019. Hope you guys are able to pick up some of these items maybe on Black Friday, throughout the weekend, Cyber Monday. They're going to have some phenomenal deals. I will put links down below to what I believe are really going to be probably the best value today. If they go on sale, phenomenal, great. If you have another product you think that you want to get, I'd say go for it. But just keep these minimum recommended specs in mind when you're doing your shopping this holiday season. If you are buying PC components and you do want to do next-gen AAA gaming on your PC. Other than that, I'll be seeing you guys later on, as I have free time now to actually do videos like this. So if there's anything you want to see, if you guys have any disagreements, or if you like what you saw, maybe hit the thumbs up button. If you don't like it, give it a big old thumbs down, leave a nasty comment down below or whatever. If you do that, I don't even care. It's all good. But I still want to wish you guys the very, very best this weekend, in your lives in general and moving forward. It's been great getting back on here, and I just want to say thank you to all the subs that stayed with me. It's been almost a year, and I lost literally almost no subscribers. So you're absolute warriors. If you're new to the channel, welcome and thank you for stopping by. But there will be more content coming soon, I promise. And I'm looking forward to seeing you guys again in the next one. Until then, peace out.